Thank you so much for joining us once again as we start a brand new week, hoping that you are doing good yourself. Let's kick off the show by looking at what is going to headline our show today. We do look at fiscal discipline today, not necessarily any distress. We want to look at R1 billion drop in the public debt. That is mounting scrutiny on Parliament's borrowing approvals. Of course, youth calling for structural change there to unlock entrepreneurship. It's Market View, and we begin now. Let's look at the news. In our first story, in a positive turn for Eswatini's economy, the latest economic report reveals a significant decline in public domestic debt for March-April 2025. Now, debt stood at 19 billion by the end of April, down from 19.9 billion in March, which is a 4.6% drop. Now, this brings the debt to 19.9% of GDP, reflecting improved fiscal management.
In the recent economic development report for March-April this year, public domestic debt was reported at 19 billion emalangeni, equivalent to 19.9% of the GDP at the end of April. This reflected a decline of 4.6% compared to the 19.9 billion emalangeni recorded in March this year. According to the Central Bank of Eswatini, the decline was primarily driven by a 900 million emalangeni repayment of the Central Bank of Eswatini advanced by the government in the review period. No new bonds were issued in the review period, according to the bank. The recent economic development report further states that in April this year, external debt stood at 16.6 billion emalangeni, about 17.4% of the GDP, portraying a 1.9% increase relative to the 16.3 billion emalangeni recorded at the end of March this year. The increase in external debt, according to the central bank, was mainly driven by the depreciation of the lilangeni against some major debt-dominated currencies. Total public debt stood at 35.6 billion emalangeni in the period ending in April this year, equivalent to 37.3% of the gross domestic product. Compared to the previous month, overall public debt decreased by 1.7% as the sources of debt reflected mixed dynamics. In the period under review, domestic debt fell while external debt reflected an increase. In March this year, the trade account recorded a positive balance of 945.5 million emalangeni. Exports for the month amounted to 3.820 billion emalangeni, recording a month-on-month increase of 5.6% and a year-on-year increase of 7%. Imports were valued at 2.874 billion emalangeni in March, falling by 10.6% month-on-month and by a marginal 0.5% year-on-year on account of a decline in majority of import categories. Exports to South Africa, which is the country's major trading partner, accounted for 66.5% of the total receipts in the month, with imports from the same market accounting for 75.4% of the total imports. For Market View, Nelson Dlangamandla, visuals from the Central Bank of Eswatini.
Turning our attention now to what the youth is saying. It says, if government can put the decentralization program into full motion, this could play a major role in uplifting entrepreneurship. Jose Rego, the chairperson of the Eswatini's Innovators Association, said this shortly after the local government conference that was held by the Ministry of Tinkhundla administration last week.
If the local government is not prioritized and empowers the citizen at the local community level, it becomes difficult for them to be empowered and to have basic services like public services, which are the first step to being able to innovate and build solutions like registering a company, applying for tax, and all these important things that as an innovator who goes into an enterprise, you must have in your toolkit before you go into the industry. So if local governments are not able to offer services to their constituencies, it becomes impossible. If the first step is for you to always travel to the central government in Mbabane capital, then you are now incurring more costs to what your business or your innovation should be focusing on. So this program for us is important because it enables the citizen at the local community level to get the services, to then be able to get information for how their innovations can be taken from the idea stage to the production stage. And if government does actually make this project successful and gets to the constituencies, then we see potential for not only the youth in those constituencies to have opportunities that they currently don't have, but even their parents and their guardians can get more services. So decentralization is more than just getting services down there to the constituency or Enkundleni. It's also about getting the information, which is what people really need before they can go into any kind of enterprise or endeavor. So this is an important one, and I'm excited that the Ministry of Tinkundla Administration and Development is able to now put it as a priority.
That is how we end our business news segment. We'll quickly go for a net break. We'll return shortly.
Eswatini TV has signed a code of conduct that is enforced by the Eswatini Communications Commission. We are committed to reporting news that is accurate, comment that is fair, and programming that does not amount to hate speech or the description of gratuitous violence or explicit sex. For any complaints of our programming, please contact us on 2411-9600 or email info@eswatinitv.co.za. You can also contact the Eswatini Communications Commission on 2406-7000 or write a letter to ECCOM on PO Box 7811 Mbabane. Email address is info@ecom.org.sz.
When you choose your adventures, you do so with an open heart and a desire for the unexpected. You embark on journeys to discover new worlds full of wonder. You choose a path to awaken your senses, a world to make you look up and realize just how inspiring this life can be. Arrive and awaken your heart. Explore life in ways only thought possible in your dreams. Discover just how far you go to expand your understanding of life's greatest mysteries. There's just one place on this planet with so much to offer. Now is the time for you to have the royal experience.
All right, now before we get into our Enterprise Watch segment today, we want to get into this important conversation on market analysis. We do want to extend, that apology that we start with our usual last segment today, but you will get your Enterprise Watch segment. But Sanele Spear is already in studio. In fact, he's right here on this very same desk. Good afternoon, Sanele. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Global markets, I think we should start there. The U.S., obviously Dow Jones Industrial Average and the Nasdaq Composite, so that's the S&P 500. They're all posting 1% gains. What is behind this coordinated rally across these three major indices?
Thank you, Mr. Nxumalo. Good afternoon to the viewer. So what we are looking at happening in the U.S. when we're seeing those gains coming from is the fact that, last week Friday, we were waiting for that non-farm payroll data coming through. And actually, it showed that the U.S. economy did better than, most people expected. So that's why we're seeing the numbers with the S&P 500 back at that 6,000 mark. The Nasdaq back at that 19,000 mark, almost closer to the 20,000 mark. So what we're seeing is market markets are back to let's say pre-Liberation Day type of rally, so there is a bit of that stability and the strength coming through from the U.S. economy based off of that jobs data does show that, albeit all of these movements and shifts, the economy did actually produce more jobs than in the previous quarters, and it actually performed far better than expected, and we should expect that to trickle into your GDP numbers and quite a number of other avenues. But we are still waiting and seeing those risks coming through from that inflation data, and markets are now going to try and weigh what this means in terms of the interest rate trajectory. If the economy is doing relatively well, it does give the Federal Reserve Bank that scope to just sit back and not do nothing at the present moment. But we are waiting to see the GDP data for the next quarter.
I mean, one thing is the simplest thing to pick up is that investor sentiment is returning quite broadly.
Yeah.
You look at an index like the Nasdaq, which is tech heavy, and you want to ask yourself, is it pulled by something sector specific?
So what we're seeing there, we had at the start of the year, at the beginning of the year, since the second half of last year, the artificial intelligence rally has been what has been driving, trade within at the Nasdaq and those stocks. So we're just waiting to see as companies begin to turn a corner and become profitable, just making profits out of artificial intelligence and making it a pure business venture right now rather than a concept, as it were. But we do also note that, when you look at the trade talks around those rare earth minerals and those, your cobalt and quite the other elements that are quite crucial in the manufacturing of those chips. And we've also seen a movement of TSMC moving back into the US. So there are those movements, and that's why we're seeing that, bolstered sentiment within the US economy, because there is that increased chip security within that sector.
Interesting times indeed, because while everything is climbing in the US, I know a man whose numbers are really dwindling right now, and he is lamenting every decision that is made, from joining the White House to leaving it and everything that is currently ensuing right now. But, while everything is climbing, I think Europe, much like Elon Musk's account right now, is in the red. What is happening there?
But so with Europe, what we are expecting to see, Ngumalo, is those numbers, the talks between the US and China. So that's going to give us a signal in terms of whether those 50% tariffs are going to be negotiated. We're just going to get clearer signals in terms of where the economy is actually going. So that's what markets are looking into right now. And I would say that it's not necessarily a bad mood in Europe, but rather it's just markets correcting to that overall equilibrium, because we're still on that 8,800 mark on the S&P of the FTSE 100. The DAX remains at that 24,175. But where we're seeing sluggish movement and markets moving slower than expected is actually within Paris.
So day-to-day fluctuations that we can credit to geopolitical risks, so to speak. Good enough. Asia's performance, quite the mixed bag, if you like, but mostly in the green. Let's move to Asia. Talk to me about the sentiment here. What is really rallying these numbers?
So there's a couple of stories there. We have Japan, which we know that Japan, there is an issue of that conundrum, in terms of how they're going to play around with long-term debt within Japan. And when you look into China and Hang Seng, there is that issue now to do with that long-term stability and whether China can actually push this trade war forward. What we're seeing there happening actually is China is standing firm, and China continues to bolster their companies with all the stimulus packages. And when they come into Japan, again, Japan is a bit hopeful in terms of what's going to happen in terms of those China-US talks, because it is actually going to trickle what will happen in Japan. But still, the Nikkei is struggling to get back to those 42,000, that pre-Liberation Day type of movements, staying relatively close at that 38,000, those November figures, November 2024 figures that we're seeing right there.
Am I wrong for reading this as a China recovery story? or it's something much broader?
It's broader. It's a much broader story. It's more at how markets are factoring in the variable of the trade war.
Okay.
So right now the markets are quite plausible and quite confident that China will indeed, push back on America, right? But what that then means is there is opportunity and scope for all the other countries to then come up with, better deals from the table compared to when China also would have actually folded.
Is this global optimism what is happening in South Africa? We're seeing a modest gain that is being posted here at 0.18%. Is it, the global optimism or domestic drivers behind it?
So in South Africa, we're seeing a lot of domestic drivers playing into it, but there is a component of domestic optimism. There is a component of those international movements and those trade wars that are playing there, but it's largely due to domestic optimism. Recollect that we've seen a couple of things happen in the South African economy in the past 2 weeks. We've seen interest rates go down. Markets laughed that, and they're still trying to just get their heads around in terms of what that means for liquidity and all these other issues within the market. And we're seeing quite a lot of corporate action with, companies, your Anglo Gold splitting to different components, and also within the insurers, we've seen Sanlam, taking over quite a number of units in Nigeria. And we're seeing all of that happening, the restructuring of business in South Africa. And the other macroeconomic indicator that we've seen was the passing of the fiscal framework. So yes, finally South Africa has a budget, and markets love that.
It's a long time coming.
Yeah.
Anyway, commodities and quickly currency movements. We are seeing gold prices dipping slightly by 0.25%. What is this signaling?
So what we're seeing there in terms of gold is, the strength of the U.S. economy now, paints a different picture in terms of where the economy is going to go, right? So it just seems, people are blue-ticking the tariffs. Life continues, as it were. So the expected impact seems to be fading away,
Right.
and, we are within this period of that freeze. So essentially, the tariffs did not live long enough to have an impact on the real economy because they were just a day thing. But we're seeing Brent crude on the surge now. Again, those numbers were very good. Those are job numbers that are non-farm payroll data that came out. Signaling a bit of strength in the American economy. And then you couple that with what China is doing and what the investments that Europe is making. So we do foresee a bit of a slight increase in demand, and that's what the futures in terms of price of oil are predicting. And then in terms of currencies, those non-farm payroll data numbers that came out actually bolstered the dollar a bit, and though we are closing, we were closing higher today, but if you look at the numbers, hour on hour, you will see that we did somehow fall down to that 1780 type of mark. So we're now back to that 1771. So that because of those numbers that are coming out there. Same thing with those defense spending in Europe and all of the issues around Ukraine. The European Union is really just spending big on their defense, and that now bolsters the euro. And then the Japanese yen, the debt problems remain within the Japanese yen, and we're seeing that lose a bit of ground today.
So let's be our economist here. He was just giving us a snapshot of how markets are moving. Enterprise Watch is on standby.
Mhlonishwa, siyabonga kakhulu ukuba nathi ka-Market View lamuhla. Ngithite angite kuwe Mhlonishwa, njengoba sikubonile emavikini laphelile uphusha kakhulu ema-loan bills lena ya 4 billion emalangeni leta ufaka ekhathi nekwekuthi bosomabhizinisi labasupplya hulumende babhadaleke imali yakhona uthite ila kubo 2 billion emalangeni. Ngidawucala nje ngekuthi ngicela usichazele ukuthi bekumcokwa kangakanani ukuthi lama loan bills lawa aphase endlini yabaye esikhulu nekuthi kumcokwa kangakanani ukuthi vele uhulumende ayithole le mali lafisa kuyiboleka.
Lama bills nawabuka kokucala nje ngibekise ngemgwaqo lesuka lesipofana niyojabula ubosiphambanweni umgwaqo lo thatha 105 kilometers 0.8 ngumgwaqo lokwana sakuthi utawuletha intuthuko kuleli gubudla lonke lelashishiselweni. So umgwaqo on its own you can't go wrong in terms of economic development. That's one. Two, kuna two ema-bills kuthi nje abole kwemabhange ahlukene ema-bills lato ufaka gezi kuleli live lakangwane we currently sitting at 88% coverage yale live. So lama-bills lawo lemithetho angisho njalo ukuthi lemithetho le i-bill ngeSiswati kuthiwa ngumthetho lokhankanywayo. So lo mthetho lesikhankanyako ke leyo itawufaka le live itawufaka le live likhanyise le live ngabogezi kuphindze futhi kusitakale ngisho laba lokhanza ukuthi banetinkinga tekuwayarisha lemakhaya ngoba busweti busesekhona budlangile futhi kukhona labanye lokhanza ukuthi abakhona ngisho nokuwayarisha emakhaya. So ke itane ukuthi nasakhona logeza ngenile kukhona lo kusuwa i-ready board. Le ready board kusho ukuthi iyamfakela lo mdzala afakele even though logeza uba limited lelafakwa ukuthi akwadi ukukhanyisa nje. So kutaba ngilo bese kuba obviously ke sengile le khulunywa ngayo kakhulu le strategic oil reserve nayo leyo nawubuka ukuthi lo mthetho lona sayicala nini nga-2013 nakuyosha soil ingosi nayo hlaba lisoile it was 2013. It has taken this long so lo pass phezulu lokhu seyigcinende kanini nga-2025 hayi ukuthi kude bokwendeka but bekunetinkinga over the years. So this is where we are.
Kune concern lekhona Mhlonisha yekutheni kwangathi letikwelede latifunako uhulumende setiningi kakhulu. I-International Monetary Fund nje ithi kufanele le debt to GDP ratio ingabi ngetulu kwa 40%. Kepha ke ushido nawethula lama loan bills lawa kwekuthi le debt to GDP ratio yethu itawukhula ibe lapha ku 46%. Engabe niyaye nicikilekele kangakanani kwekuthi kungakhanzakali ukuthi lival sakhona ibhadala tikweleti ngobe mhlambe sesiboleke kakhulu.
Uqinisile sisileyo concern I see misplaced justified ifanele futhi kube ibe khona but nje njengoba ngibuka la cingweni lami tinombolo tethu tiyasikhomba ukuthi kufanele siциkelele tingaphakami kakhulu. Ngidawubekisa nje ku 2024 2025 kelode tethu beti 42.1. So ngalama bills lo washokwe sesihleli lapha kubo 46%. Now kopha naso ubuka kulamanye mave lekungathi kumbe sinawo la ku Southern Africa na ku East ngibekuse nje elisuthu leliqisho libengangathi lona luhleli ku 59.9%. That is 2024-2025. Angathi ke ukuthi the latest itsini yabo ku 2025 to 2026 boKenya bahleli ku 68.8 2024-2025. Ngitama ukuthi kuyiconcern kithi sine lesifuqa lomsebenzi hayi ukuthi kumele nje kube kuma economists kuphela. Nathi siyakhuluma nathi siyakubuka le debt management before siyiphasise sifuna kwathi ukuthi sokusele ngakanani. Ngidawubekisa nje kunayile suka kwenje lesanza kukhuluma sithi uhulumende siyabona siyabhadala siyaboleka tikwelete tiyanzi kepha asosichazele ukuthi sekuseleti ngaki lesitibhadala nathi nje sitibhadala kulomnyaka tikwelete letinzala waletha uhulumende luhla lonke lwa 15 wetikwelete sitabe siticedzile in the next 5 years, that is between 2025 na 2030 sitabe sicedze 15 wetikwelete letinkulu letingasinto letincane. Nangisakhuluma ngala mabhilisi ngikhohle kusho ukuthi kunalena lenye lakhanza ukuthi uhulumende i-loan bill uyoclearisha tikwelete tebantfu lakabakweleta ema-areas bosomabhizinisi labancane balimele la nalabanye labakholedwa nguhulumende lapho uyoboleka 100 million US dollars kuclearisha lezo zikweleti sikholelwa ukuthi angeke bese sesibuyela kuleyo nkinga futhi nasaclearishile uhulumende lezo zikweleti takhe.
Ngiyakuva mhlonishwa uthi eminyakeni lesihlanu letako uhulumende utawubabhadala 15 wetikweleti. Ngiyafisa kuva ukuthi engabe neyi-portfolio committee ningena kangakanani ekutheni le mali naseyibolekiwe yenda lo msebenzi lona levele ibolekelwe wona singaboni nakulokuyaye kwendeka ukhanze kuthematiko lamaningi sekayayovela embi kwe-PAC ngekuthi imali ayikasebenzi ngalendlela lekufanele isebende ngayo.
Uqinisile Mdungwa siqilikele lokho this time around anganayo na le 5.2 billion sithe ngeke sende lento besiyenda idolo ngokuthi sesimnikile uhulumende and then sekuphelile ngathi sesibuka lokunye we will monitor the implementation nakule lapho uhulumende akweleta khona lamaswati lalababhadala kubalulekile lokuthi ababhadale in fact asingakubalekeli lokuthi it's bad cash management lokuthi utahamba uyoboleka kubhadala ikwelede debantu lobakweleta lokubalekile ukuthi umanage ukuthi labantu nawuthatha ikwelede utithatha within your means within your limit njengawe nje ngeke uthathe uyoboleka ikwelede etingetulu kweliholo lakho ngoba lokho ngeke usakhona kuphila so uhulumende kufanele lokwakugathe sithemba ukuthi ke nase clearishekelela amaswati kufanele uhulumende acizekele lo bengeke acte kahle because lama suppliers niwo la jereta la phamisa le economy in as much as back business but labantu baqashe abantu nale economy yaphakama ngalokuthi ngeke kulunge ukuthi lawo bantu laba ngabalinyatwa nguhulumende ngako ke sibona ukuthi asiyiphasise leyo loan
ungabe disekhona yini mhlonishwa letinye tikweleti uhulumende latawutiboleka lenisetawutisebenta.
I'm sorry to say ukuthi itikweleti emafalishito lathi lisaletha letinye lamanye loans kuliqinise lokho kodwa ke lokubalekile ngokuthi kufanele sibuke nyalo sibe vigilant sibuke lokho ukuthi le loan nayitholakala angathi nokuthi maybe iparliament kufanele ingene kusiphi isigaba ngoba lokungena at the tail end yale loan process akusimisi kahle maybe lokubalekile ngiloko ukuthi sine singena at the tail end ekugcineni kwale process lapha naba negotiator nako lapho khona kufanele kube clear lokuthi le loan nayicelo one itawathuthukisa inamaswati nangisho njalo ngiyabekisa kunebaka construction kuthiwa i-construction industry council labaka CIC basemthethweni bakho ngumthetho laba ama contractors ngeke ke ukuthi nawutawuthuta wakha a huge facility kule live bese so uthi no akube inkampani yangaphandle kuphela 100%. So we need to be vigilant because ekugcineni kwakho vele lama loans atawubhadalwa ngithi I think ukuthi ngasibe vigilant ukuthi lo mqumo wale local participation ubonakale. I think that's where lapho khona start impose khona going forward because itolo lokuthi iparliament iqhamuka sekusayiniwe ama agreements leso kwendiwe sekuta at the tail end maybe that is our undoing.
Sewuhamba mhlonishwa ingabe ungathini nje kuna sive noma ke ma economists lesekanako ukuphaphuleka kwangathi uhulumende nje uyathatha nje dikweleti ngaphandle kwekuthi acabangisise lokuthi utawudibhadala kanjani.
Ama economists kokucala nje siyawathanda futhi siyawajabulela because they are professionals but bona bale advantage yokuthi basinike i-information le based on statistics ne data bangalengisithi nebo layman labakhuluma ngekubuka emehlo so kungaba kuhle ukuthi nabakhuluma abaphikisana nale information lokhanza ukuthi sisuke sinayo le scientific proven so ke kutosida lo bangakhulumi i-concern lengakabi based on nothing nithi ke siyacela lokuthi sibambisane nabo vele siyafisa nalokuthi sisebenze nabo kakhulu etinzabeni letinjengaleti the debt management but ke singayibalekeli lokuthi ikhona i-scientific information kufanele siyikhulumise le scientifically proven information nyalo nje lokunye lengidaphindze ngikunike kona ngaphandle kwale list ya 15 ngidakunika ukuthi i-rating yeSwaziland level yaseSwatini ikuphi nyalo compared to lamanye emave nalokuthi athi nema comments ngayo ngiko ukuthi nasita kubamba ngasihamba ngaleyo data lekhona sikhulume ngaleyo kungasida lo but singakhulumi kuba sibe ku gallery ukhanze ukuthi asiwabeki lama facts ukuthi anjani ama facts will always be there. I'm not an economist but I have a good understanding of facts and figures. Thank you very much.
Siyabonga kakhulu Mhlonishwa kuba nathi elihlelweni Market View. So sichazele ukuthi uhulumende nakata wenda tikweletu uhlala phasi ajule abonisane nalo komiti kanti sewushito nekwekuthi tikhona tikweleti leti tawubhadalwa eminyakeni lesihlanu letako ukuthi nakufika letinye titawube sediphela. Thank you so much Mhlonishwa kuba nathi elihlelweni lamuhla.
More of Market View as the week progresses. Have yourself a good afternoon. Bye-bye.